It's the highest pleasure today to be talking with Stephen Kershnar. We'll talk about the duty to tip, but before we do, Stephen, could you say a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. I am a philosopher and lawyer that specializes in applied ethics. It's a real pleasure and honor to be on your show, so thank you for inviting me. And I discuss a number of issues, some of which are controversial, some of which are not. And my opinions reflect are those of my own, and don't reflect any employer or group with which I'm associated.
Perfect. Okay, so jumping in, could you just outline quickly your basic argument for why there is a duty to tip your servers?
Good. So I think there's a duty to tip servers. It's actually controversial whether there is a duty and why there is a duty. But my claim is that there is a duty, and the reason there is a duty is because customers promise to pay the server, and because you have a duty, a prima facie duty, to satisfy your promises. Therefore, customers have a duty to pay the server. Now, it's a little mysterious as to why we have a duty to pay the server, for example, or bartenders, or sky caps, or bell caps, or caddies, but not, for example, people who work in fast food restaurants, or not for doormen who open the door for us. And so there's this odd result that we seem to have the duty to some people, but not others, and also what generates the duty. So, for example, in the United States, to the extent that a server's wages fall below the minimum, the employer has to make up for it. So you might wonder, why isn't the duty to pay the server on the employer rather than the customer? But my claim is that there's a promise that's actually made. And the interesting feature of it is the promise is silent. It's implied in terms of ordering the food, but it is made nonetheless.
Okay, so the last point is really important. When people order food, they never say, "I hereby promise to tip you at the end of the meal." And so you're claiming that people promise to tip their servers without ever saying that they promise their servers. This might just lead to an objection to the view. The objection is, well, all I've done is order the bruschetta. I've never said that I promised to tip you. That wasn't the content of the Speech Act. So why do you think that there is an implicit promise to tip the server?
So you might think there's conversational implicature in the conversation, right? We often say things that are not strictly speaking accurate, but the conversation makes it clear what we're saying. So, for example, in the Midwest, you might, when you say, "Do you want this or that?" someone might say, "I could care less." Well, that would suggest that you might care quite a lot about it, but what they mean is, "I couldn't care less." Or if they say, do you want Coke or Pepsi? They say, "Same difference." Well, they only have same difference if you have 4 items. But again, we have a conversational implicature that we sort of understand what people are saying. So if you look at what happens when someone goes into a restaurant, the vast majority, I think the following thoughts. Most customers think the following. They think, number one, I have a duty to pay the server. Number two, the duty is owed to the server, not to the employer. Number three, this is covered by convention. And number four, my ordering the food in combination with the other 3 is what generates this duty. Servers think the same thing. Servers outrage, a waitress, for example, is outraged if you don't leave her. So this alignment suggests that not only is there conversational implicature in terms of ordering the food, but that the conversational implicature succeeds. That is, both the person making the promise and the person receiving the promise, that is implicitly giving uptake to the promise, align. So we have a promise that's made and therefore a duty generating.
I take it that the expectation that customers will tip their servers varies cross-culturally. For example, when I was a waiter for about 2 months, I didn't pick up on any expectation that customers would tip me for the service. So I don't know if that was representative of the UK in general or just the kind of restaurant that I was working in. So in the US, what's the evidence that you go on to suggest that there is such an expectation, rather than a general perception that tipping is a nice but supererogatory act that the customer can or can't choose to take?
Yeah, so excellent point. I mean, is it a supererogatory act? Legally, it's not legally required. There's at least one case where a prosecutor said, no, look, there's no legal duty here. The argument is based on anecdote. I wish I had studies, but I don't. And that is just, if you ask most customers, they think, yeah, you have a duty to leave a tip. And then you ask them to explain why. They give something like, the explanation I've just given. The fact that servers seem to have the same understanding, and in general, despite your understanding, a lot of servers are outraged when you don't tip them. That seems to show that they do have the same understanding. So since we have an alignment of the person who I claim is making the promise, or at least I claim is making the promise, and the person receiving the promise, that is the uptake regarding it, that seems to be evidence that a promise has been made. Notice also that this explains the difference between cultures. So for example, in the US, the tipping amount is often thought to be 15 to 20%, usually 20% these days. From what I understand, my data here is a little bit old, but in places like Germany, France, and Britain, it's 10%. And in some countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Turkey, and Brazil, there's no convention or custom regarding tipping. So what would explain why not only is there a difference in terms of whether you should tip, but how much you should tip? The promise seems to explain it. Note also that this hasn't always been the case. In the US, tipping didn't come about until after the Civil War. And not only that, 6 states banned it. It was thought kind of an old world master and servant relation, and therefore offensive. There were anti-tipping societies, newspapers denounced tipping, but nevertheless, it has become standard now. How do you explain this change in convention? Well, I think you explain it in terms of, assuming there is a duty, in terms of a promise being made.
Okay, one objection, even in the US context, to there being a promise made when a customer orders food to tip the server is the thought that if they order and then 5 minutes later they say, and I promise I'm going to tip you, there doesn't seem to be anything dodgy or infelicitous or nonsensical about that reassurance. But if you thought that the original speech act, the ordering food, was a promise, then it would seem strange to have to promise again, or for the second promise to add any content to what the customer is asking.
Yeah, I mean, one way to say it is, does the fact that the customer separately promised to tip, doesn't that show that there was no promise to begin with? Because if the later promise was unnecessary, then the server would say, well, yeah, I mean, I know this. I mean, this is not, telling me anything new. And I think while servers are often much too polite, I think that's just implied. I mean, I think they would say, look, I already know that. In virtue of your ordering, you've created a moral duty. It's not a legal duty, but it's a moral duty. And the fact that you're saying the same thing explicitly later on doesn't change this. In the same way that if you married a woman and then 2 weeks later you say, look, I really do plan to treat you well and to be sexually faithful. Your spouse might say, well, look, I mean, that was obvious when you married me. I mean, it's nice that you're sort of stating it a second time, but you're not anything new to the conversation. And I think the same thing is true with regard to the server. When someone says, you can imagine some nerdy lawyer who 5 minutes after ordering says, server, I hereby promise to pay you 20% of the value of the meal. I mean, you might think that, look, I mean, the nerdy lawyer can say this, but he's not adding anything to the conversation that's already been said implicitly.
Okay, so that was premise one. In some cultural contexts, at least, there's an assumption on the part of the serving staff and accepted by people in general that a customer should tip the server. And so when they order food, there's an implicit promise that they will. Moving to premise two, you think that there's a prima facie obligation to keep this promise. Could you unpack why we'd have a prima facie reason to keep promises in general? It might seem obvious, but could you give an argument for it?
Sure, absolutely. I just think that a promise is just the way in which we create duties in ourselves, right? I mean, the promise, what happens when we make a promise is we use convention in order to create a duty in ourselves, right? So it's just the means. I mean, it just is the means by which we create a duty. So I think, in essence, it comes from the very nature of a promise. And we do want to be able to create duties in ourselves because this allows for stable cooperative patterns, both as a moral matter and a legal matter. And it's also, you might think that, look, it's just part of being in certain relationships, certain loving relationships, certain moral relationships, certain social relationships. Part of that is being able to create duties in ourselves. So if you're with a really good friend and the friend needs a favor, you might say, look, I promise to help you, move when it comes time to move. I mean, that's part of being a friend, but it's helpful in terms of both coordination and also in terms of strengthening the friendship to incur duties such that the other person knows the nature of the relationship, and also so they can plan accordingly.
suppose you want to order a meal and you don't want to tip. Are you obligated to warn the server in advance of ordering the food? I'm not going to tip you.
Yes.
Now here's what I'd like to put. Okay.
Yes. So what you have is you have this convention that says, look, in virtue of ordering, you've created a duty to tip the person. And it has to be an actual thought in the person. I mean, strictly speaking, there are no promises that are made unintentionally. You actually have to intend to make a promise. So, but yeah, I mean, because this is conversational implicature, you have to tell the person if you're changing the rules. For example, imagine that you come into someone's house, and part of this culture is that you don't wear your shoes. And this is understood that when you're a guest, you don't wear your shoes and you come into the house, but there's no way you're taking off your shoes. You're just, you have a thing about this, you're like Woody Allen, you're really worried about what sort of, bacteria, virus is going to pick up through your feet. And you, so you might think, look, the conversational implicature is in virtue of coming into the house and be a guest, you can take your shoes off. So if you plan on breaking that promise or not breaking it, not creating that promise, you have a duty to indicate.
One worry about this duty to indicate is the thought that maybe a server just wouldn't want you to say anything if you weren't going to tip.
I gather if the server didn't want you saying because she'd rather not deal with the awkwardness of it. I mean, what's in effect happening is she's saying, look, I value avoiding discomfort more than I value the money or you keeping your promise. But I don't think that releases you from the promise. I don't think it stops it from being created. It just says, look, she'd rather that the promise not be made explicit and your plan not to satisfy it also not be made explicit. But there's a promise created nonetheless. I mean, the fact that something's this uncomfortable doesn't mean that the obligation doesn't exist. So, for example, I mean, if your employee is going to steal small amounts from you, you'd rather not. Perhaps you'd rather not learn about it because it'd be uncomfortable to confront the employee, and he's not stealing enough to make it worth the aggravation. Still, it's wrong nonetheless. Why? Because he's infringing on your property rights.
Right. So the objection wasn't that the server's uncomfortableness would release you from the promise to tip. It was rather from the duty to indicate that you were going to not tip. So the fact that they would be awkward if you said something releases you from the obligation to say anything if you're not going to tip.
Yes, I think the fact that it's awkward doesn't release you of the obligation not to say it. It's just an obligation that we'd rather not have attention drawn to, right? So you still have if you don't plan on tipping, you still have an obligation to tell the server that you're not going to tip her. But you just might think, look, the server would prefer that the awkwardness is painful enough that you'd just rather not have attention drawn to the fact that you're not living up to your moral duty and that she's losing out on money. It's just not worth the aggravation. So I don't think that removes the obligation to say that you're changing the agreement. It just says that, look, the server would prefer the obligation just not be satisfied.
Wait, so but do you still have to follow through on that obligation? So even though the server would rather you didn't, you still have to go ahead and do it anyway?
So here it's going to get murky. If you think there's a duty not to insult someone, then you might think that would trump the other duty. I have my doubts about whether there's a duty to insult someone, just because it's unclear what right it infringes when you insult someone. It doesn't infringe on their body right. It doesn't infringe on their property right. And it's unclear that you have a right that other person not think about you in certain ways or not talk about you in certain ways. I mean, even the duty to insult, it's not clear that that's true if the way you insult someone is deserved or if it's somehow fitting giving other contexts. So it's very hard to make out the duty to insult. But if you thought there's a duty not to insult someone, then you might think you have conflicting duties. You have a duty not to insult someone, but you also have a duty to say that you're not going to live up to your promise to pay a tip. And there you might think, look, the duty not to insult someone would trump the other one in some cases. In other cases, the duty to change the contractual agreement trumps the duty not to insult. And it seems to be very specific to the particular situation.
And are you characterizing making a server feel awkward as an insult in that case? So if I tell them that I'm not going to tip, You're characterizing the awkwardness that they feel as me having insulted them in that case, right?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it's just clarity, right? If you say, look, imagine you're at the lunch counter. You're at a counter in a kind of diner, and you think, okay, it's a little unclear if you have to tip at the. I mean, I think you do, but imagine it's unclear whether you're at the counter rather than the table. So the cook's serving you directly, whether you have a duty to tip the cook. Okay, in that case, you might think, well, clarity is called for in terms of what your promise is. And there's going to be no insult either way. The cook might say, like, I'm not insulted. I'm a cook. I'm not a server. You don't have to tip me. So, whether there's going to be an insult or awkwardness is going to be factually specific. In some cases it is, but again, I don't know which trumps the other. I mean, I'm not sure how we would go about assessing that. We'd have to say, okay, well, what duty correlates with a stronger right? You might think the duty just is a right from the perspective of the person to whom the duty is owed. And then we'd have to say, well, what determines right stringency? And it might be something like, well, the strength of autonomy that justifies it, or the strength of harm that the amount of harm that will come about if you don't satisfy the duty. I'm not sure that either one is correct, but in any case, we'd have to have a theory of the stringency of rights to tell us which duty is going to trump the other. So I lean more towards the autonomy justification, but I mean, there's going to be problems with both accounts of what determines the stringency of a right, and therefore the how strong the duty is that either correlates or constitutes that right.
Yeah. On the point of insults, some people claim that the practice of tipping itself is degrading, and that's a reason not to do it. What do you think of this claim? Some people claim it has to do with the history of tipping. So there are periods in history in which tipping appears to have expressed degrading attitudes towards the server. Do you think that it was wrong in those cases? And do you think that it's degrading now?
So you're absolutely right that this view of degrading was very strongly held. So after the Civil War, when tipping apparently began, a lot of people thought this was really degrading, that this reminded people of the master-servant relationship in Europe, and Americans didn't want any part of it. And so, as mentioned earlier, like a number of states, 6 states, banned it outright. Newspapers denounced it. There were anti-tipping societies. And the idea is that's degrading. And let's be clear what degrading is. Degrading occurs when one person expresses the idea or treats a person in a way which says that the person who's being treated has less value than they actually do. So it says they are degraded in the sense that their value is lower than what it actually is. Okay, a couple of concerns here. One is, I'm not sure there is a duty not to degrade people. You might think that people can consent to being degraded. Consider, for example, people who engage in sadomasochistic sex. I mean, you might think, look, they consent to be degraded, right? You might think that, in some sense, exotic dancers consent to be degraded. It's a little hard to see what the wrong maker is if a person gives valid consent to it. So I guess 2 issues arise here. 1, do I think tipping is degrading? And 2, if it were to be degrading, would that make it wrong? Let's take the first question first. I don't see it as being degrading. I mean, you have in employment contexts, and just in context in general, you have subordination that doesn't entail degradation. For example, in the military, you have a hierarchy. It's not clear the hierarchy is degrading. It serves an important function. When you have professors and students in the classroom, there's a certain hierarchy there. Again, it doesn't seem to be degrading. And in the employment context, right, the employer, in some sense, is the employee is subordinate to the employer. Again, it doesn't seem to be degrading. I mean, this might be because the relationship is rational, or it might be because the people have validly consented to it. But whatever the explanation, it doesn't seem to be degrading, and I fail to see how tipping someone is different than this. But even if it were degrading, it's a little hard to see why expressive content harms someone or so wrongs someone. Now, intuitively, it certainly seems to, right? I mean, you insult someone, they feel wronged, I feel wronged. I'm kind of a sensitive baby about being insulted. But it's actually a little bit hard to see it. I mean, I don't have a right to what another person thinks. I don't have a right to what another person says in private. So why should it differ if they think something and say it around me? Why would that change things? It's a little hard to see what right is infringed. And if it is infringed, it seems to conflict with the body right. When if a person owns himself, then he owns his body. And if he owns his body, he can do what we want with it, so long as he's not, on my account, touching someone else's body or property. He doesn't do that when he says something insulting. Now, it still might be vicious to do so. That is, indicates a bad character in the insulter. It might be morally bad. That is, it makes the world worse because you've made at least one person's life go worse. But it's a little hard to see why it's wrong. So I guess in short, I'm long-winded about this. But number one, I don't think that tipping is degrading. And number two, even if it were degrading, I don't think that would make it wrong. But I'm kind of curious about your view on this. I mean, so you've worked as a server. Did you find it degrading to be a server?
No. I think this is a spurious objection. I just thought we needed to cover it for completeness. So there are cases in which tipping obviously could be degrading if you tip well below the minimum to an insulting degree. So if you tip someone 1 penny for their service, that's worse than tipping nothing. But there are cases even when people would tip small amounts of change and it didn't feel degrading. So people would pay, say, £40, would have a meal that cost £39 and they'd pay £40 in cash, and then they'd say, you keep the change, that's your tip. And so it would be a low tip, it would be £1. It's not near the normative tip of 15 to 20%, but that didn't feel degrading. It was just a cute little bonus. So I don't relate to this idea at all.
Well, let me actually, so there's kind of an interesting thing about the money dependence, how the actual amount of money matters here. So for example, you might think, even on the view that's degrading, I mean, imagine a server at a high-end restaurant in Manhattan, and he's making, $100,000 a year in tips. It's a little hard to see what the degradation. I mean, he's paid a lot to put up with various pesky customers. Whereas you might think, well, someone making $10,000, that's a very different matter. But it's a little hard to see why the tipping itself would be degrading if it depends on how much money is paid out. Someone might instead think, like you said, that the money paid out when it's below a fair price. But I think that raises the issue outside of convention. What is the fair price? I mean, if we have a convention, probably works through, my claim is through promise, because conventions themselves don't bind us. But if it's not dependent on convention, imagine we're arriving at a new society and it's partially Japanese and Korean and partially American, U.S. and Canadian, and we're deciding, okay, what's the tipping convention going to be? And someone says, well, it should be a fair price. I mean, what is the fair price? Number one, I'm not sure there is a fair price. I don't think there's any principled way to tell us what a fair price is, number one. And number two, you might think, look, there's a more fundamental question. Why is the duty to compensate the server put on the customer rather than the employer? I mean, after all, the server is an employee. It's a little bit odd as to why suddenly in this one region the duty is on the customer rather than the employee. Consider professional sports, right? So millions of people watch the National Football League or the soccer in Britain and the Premier League, and so you might wonder, well, why is the duty to pay the top players? Why is that on the owner rather than the millions of customers who watch? And I don't think there's an answer here, right? I mean, we have certain conventions that, okay, in restaurants and in, when you have a caddy and when someone's a bellhop, there, someone's a barber, there the customer tips, so at least supplements what the employer pays. But in other cases, the employer pays. I'm not sure that there is a justification for the difference other than a promise. I mean, you could see the claim that efficiency explains the difference, but number one, I don't think, the studies are mixed as to whether or not efficiency explains the difference. And number two, even if it were efficient to tip people, that doesn't mean that there's a duty. We don't have a duty to bring about efficient outcomes.
You mentioned in your response that conventions don't bind us, but this is fairly counterintuitive, right? So suppose I'm unaware of the convention to tip, and the convention to tip in the society is very, very, very strong. And I go in and I sit down and I order, and then I become aware of the convention. Somebody tells me. It seems implausible to think that then I would have no obligation to tip because I wasn't aware of the obligation when I ordered. It seems like the cultural norm is still morally binding on me, even if I wasn't aware of it beforehand?
Sure. So the question is, and I think that's a really good point. So imagine someone came to this country from a country where they don't tip and ordered food, and then afterwards told, hey, by the way, you have a duty. You have a duty to tip. And the person said, well, I didn't know that. I can't make a promise if I don't have the relevant thoughts. So doesn't that show the duty of tip depends on convention and not on promise? And I think the answer to that is no. Because number one, the mere fact that somebody's convention doesn't mean that you have a duty to do it. I mean, if someone, if we had a convention that you take off your hat in the presence of social superiors, you might think, well, that might be a convention, but there's no duty to do it, right? Or if you had a so you might think etiquette applies here. You don't want to be rude or insulting in general, and so maybe this is a case where you're worried about the other person's feelings. Again, the strikes. I'm not sure that etiquette is really a moral duty. So here's an example where you seem to have done something that's hurts the person's feelings, but it's not clear that you've you'd be apologetic, but it's not clear that you've done something wrong. So imagine that you're over at a dinner party and you've read this book on a natural history theory of rape, and you think, look, there's evolutionary reasons to think that males rape females, both among human beings and other animals. But there's someone at the table who was a rape victim, and it really upsets her quite a bit. You might think, well, that's a terrible thing to do. I mean, you feel horrible about what you've done, but it's not clear that you've done anything wrong. It's not clear that you've infringed anyone's rights. And so, again, the mere fact that some of the convention doesn't seem to bind us. I mean, the fact that we have various patterns that we coordinate, it depends on those patterns being just or morally required. And in the absence of that, it's unclear why we have a duty. Yeah, I'm just not sure why this isn't a case of etiquette rather than promise. So, I mean, imagine that. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, so there are all sorts of places where you might violate convention, and you might think the hell with convention. So you might think, look, if you have a speaker and you have this really devastating objection, you might think, well, look, when it's a big enough name, you don't give your devastating objection. And you might think, the hell with that convention. I mean, I'm part of the faculty or the students that spent time and money to come hear this person speak, and the fact that screw the convention. It's not a good convention, or even if it is a good convention, it's one I choose not to live up to. So it's a little hard to see why convention itself would justify it. Convention might be justified because it's efficient, because it encourages cooperation, or because we promise to follow it. But that's not convention per se. And the other ones are not very good justifiers. The fact that something's efficient does not by itself, unless you're a consequentialist, does not by itself justify something, right? The fact that something encourages cooperation is not itself a duty, because you don't have a duty to encourage cooperation, right? There's no positive right that someone has against you that you encourage cooperation. So once we see that convention itself is not a justifier, we need something else. Promise is by far the most plausible candidate here.
Why not just conjoin rights theory with the view that consequences also matter? And so tipping can be obligatory on the grounds of promising. But if you weren't aware that you'd made a promise and you subsequently find out about the convention, and your server's feelings will be hurt if you don't tip, the duty to tip can then come from the fact that it will hurt the server's feelings.
Okay, so an excellent objection. So why don't we have like dual justifications here? One is good consequences, and the other is a right-based account. Well, two things here. Number one, you might think that we don't think the consequences justify tipping, and here's an example. Imagine that we think the society would work much better if, in fact, people didn't tip, right? So by refusing to tip, you make society works better, because you'd force paying servers to be put on employers, and that would be much more efficient, much more direct, and much more predictable. You still think you should tip. So it shows you that good consequences are not what justifies tipping. And good consequences in general, and this is going to bring us to a discussion of consequentialism more generally, but you might think that consequentialism itself is not true. I mean, here would be an example. If consequentialism were true, we'd have a duty to reproduce, produce a lot of a lot of offspring, but we normally don't think you have such a duty. Again, this assumes that your children are going to grow up to be happy, happy, successful people. But we don't think we have such a duty. Why? Because you don't have a duty to maximize the good. In addition, it's a little hard to see how the two duties would compete. If you have a duty to respect people's rights and a duty to bring about the best consequences, which one trumps the other when they conflict? It's often going to be the case that respecting someone's right is not going to maximize the good. So you have this problem of conflicting duties that occur all the time. But the more fundamental point is that, look, I just don't think that the duty tip is based on consequences. One, it's not clear this is true. I mean, you might be contributing to a system which is both inefficient, which is inefficient and has other problems as well. But you also might think that you have a duty tip even if it is inefficient, and that shows you that consequences are not doing the justificatory work here. The promises.
So on the first point, you might think, well, it's true that the system of tipping overall doesn't maximize the good, but I'm not in charge of the system. I'm just in charge of whether I tip. And so since by tipping I'm not upholding or sustaining a system by myself, I'm still doing a good on balance, because the contribution I make to the bad system is very tiny, whereas the benefit that I give to the server is quite large. And then on the second point, couldn't you have a view where consequences matter, but you don't have a duty to maximize? So you don't have a duty to reproduce necessarily, but you might have a duty to satisfy. So you have a duty to do good up to a certain level, but not to the maximum degree.
Sure. So no, we don't think the consequences apply in this way in general. So imagine that you're a fairly wealthy person and the server is a poor person, and you've tipped 20%. But if you tip 50%, you create a lot more good in the world, because the remaining 30% has a much lower utility to you than it does to the server. We don't think you have a duty to tip 50%, but it would be a duty, perhaps one that's overridden, but there would be a duty if your duty was to bring about the best consequences. In terms of the duty to satisfy, so it's like not maximize, I find this to be utterly mysterious. I mean, I don't quite know what satisficing is. Does it mean that you just make the world a better place to some degree? Does it mean that you don't make it worse? Does it mean that you're doing 75% of what maximization is? It's entirely mysterious. But more generally, if you think, for example, which is kind of a non-consequentialist intuition, that except in the case with catastrophic overrides, you have a duty only if you have a duty owed to someone, then it's unclear what to whom the duty to satisfy should be owed. That is, if you could give to waitress A who actually served you, or waitress B who did not, but it'll have more good for waitress B, you might think, well, wouldn't the satisficing tell us we should give it to waitress B? I mean, it might be that it's going to produce a lot more good, and only giving it to waitress B will get us to 75% of maximization. I think the answer to that is no, right? You should give it to waitress A. She's the one who served you. What this tells us are two things. Number one, I don't think there's a duty to satisfy. And two, even if there were a duty to satisfy, it wouldn't explain our duty to tip. So in short, I don't think consequences justify tipping. Again, think about tipping 50% rather than 20%. And two, I don't think satisficing does, because it would result in the fact that we'd tip the wrong server. And that seems to be incorrect. So I like the suggestion. I think it's an excellent one. But at the end of the day, I don't think it works.
Okay. So tomorrow you're golfing at the golf course, and there's a convention that you tip your caddy after you're done. And just as you're reaching into your pocket, you notice that in one of the ponds on the golf course, a child is drowning. And to get the child out, it's a very big pond. People need to build a bridge. To build a bridge, they need to build funds. And so somebody comes around with a small jar collecting money from everyone in order to build a bridge so as to fish the child out of the pond. And with your $10, you could either give it to the caddy and discharge your promissory duty to tip him, or you could put it in the money jar and significantly contribute to the effort of saving the child's life. In that case, what's your intuition? Should you put it in the tip jar, or should you put it in the money jar, or should you tip the caddy? And if you think that you should put it in the money jar, doesn't this mean that the duty to tip in real world circumstances is always defeated by the countervailing duty to give your money to effective charities like the Against Malaria Foundation that save children?
Good, it's perfect. Yeah. So do you have a duty to, use your money in a way which is going to achieve a lot of good, maybe even save a child's life, or to tip the caddy? A superb suggestion. A couple things here. Number one, note that you might think saving a child's life or multiple children's life is a catastrophic override. So this kind of overrides our deontological duties. Perhaps, I'm not sure it's actually significant enough to do that, but perhaps you could have that sort of massive override. Number two, notice also that this assumes that there is a duty to save. I don't think there is a duty to save. I think you can see it in a couple of different ways, but here's two quick ones. If you have a duty to save someone owed to that person, then that person has a claim against you that you save him. If the person has a claim against you, then it would seem, I claim it follows, that the person owns your body or your labor in some way, or some feature of your body or labor. But I don't think the person who needs saving owns your body or your labor. So I don't think there's a duty to save. And you can see this intuitively, right? If you have a duty to save a child who's drowning before you, then you might have a duty to give, to give money to, Oxfam or an anti-malarial organization or something like that. But you might think you don't have a duty to give to that organization, right? And because they're indistinguishable, you don't have a duty to save the child. Now, sometimes people say, well, it's a reasonable effort to save the child, but it's an unreasonable effort to give $5,000. But it's unclear what reasonable means here. I mean, if reasonable means that you'd be blameworthy for one but not for the other, number one, I'm not sure why that is. But number two, blameworthiness is a different issue from wrongfulness, right? We want to separate out when you're blameworthy for something or when you acted wrongfully. So I don't think there's a duty to save. Again, perhaps except with a catastrophic override. And if there's no duty to save, then there's no duty to give money towards the bridge. But there is a duty to give it to the caddy in virtue of the promise that you've made. So no, I don't think you should give it to the bridge building. I think you should give it to the caddy. And imagine the same thing is true. Imagine that a server has served someone and got them 6 refills of coffee and all sorts of things, and then she's waiting for her tip, and then the person being a student of Peter Singer tells her, well, I was about to tip you $10, but I'm going to actually tip you $0. I'm going to give it to Oxfam Relief instead, because after all, that's going to save children. Just intuitively, you can see what's wrong there. And what explains it is there is no duty to save, and even if there was, for some reason it doesn't, override the server's claim here. One other way you can see that is if there's a duty to save, there has to be, there's just like it's a disjunctive duty, right? You could give to, let's say, 6 different groups. Let's say you have a duty to give to one, but which one of the 6 is discretionary? Well, a disjunctive duty is really strange, and a disjunctive set of rights is really strange. It's not like the 6 groups have a collective right against you, but if they don't have a collective right against you and they don't have individual rights against you, then how can you owe a duty? I mean, you might think you owe a duty, but you don't owe a duty to anyone. I find that mysterious, like a duty but not owed to anyone. So, but even if there was such a duty, you could satisfy it in ways that don't involve giving any money to those groups. Right? You could just be really nice to your friends, your spouse, your children, or there are other ways to satisfy it. It's very mysterious how you can have these duties that can be satisfied in different ways, even though they achieve very different. So I'm very skeptical of the duty to save in large part because I think there's no correlative right. Second, because I think it's counterintuitive. Third, because when we try and say, well, what would be a reasonable amount of the reasonable burden that you must bear to help others, there's no principled way to say it, to set that burden. And number 4, I think that if there were a duty to save, it would be disjunctive. And I don't know how you can have a correlative right with a disjunctive duty. So I think there's no duty to save. And as a result, I think you should pay the caddy. And same thing, the student of Peter Singer who stiffed the waitress and gave it to Oxfam Relief. I mean, shame on that student, right? Sounds to me like a Cambridge student rather than an Oxford student. But that's just my bias coming out.
Well, does your skepticism of the duty to save extend even to cases where there's literally no burden to saving the child? So suppose I'm just walking past a drowning child and I don't even have to get my shoes muddy. I can just pick the child out of the pond at no cost to myself. Do I have any moral reason to pick the child out of the pond? Do I do anything wrong if I bypass the child? Or do you think, in fact, no, I do nothing wrong if I just allow a child to drown?
Good. So if you see, the Peter Singer case, you see a child drowning in a shallow pool of water, do you have to, step in? Maybe you didn't even have to get muddy. It's clear water. So there's a couple ways to put it. So reasons are going to be ambiguous here. Is there a duty to save the child? No, because there's no correlative right? And, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. You might think, does it make the world a better place? Absolutely makes the world a better place. So the question is, do reasons, do they track the right or the good? I think you can have, deontic reasons and you can have axiological reasons. So I don't think that there's, I don't think reasons help us here because there are different types of reasons. So, but if you ask, are they deontic reasons? No. Are there axiological, again, unless there's a catastrophic override, are there axiological reasons? Yes. So, but ask yourself the following. Obviously you're an extraordinarily bright guy. I'm going to make the following assertion about you, which may or may not be true, but I'm just going to say this. You'd undoubtedly be an outstanding surgeon, and you'd probably do a lot more good as a surgeon than you would do as a philosophy professor at an elite university, which is my guess where you're headed. So the question is, do you have a duty to become a surgeon? Well, let me ask you that. Do you think you have a duty to become a surgeon? Let's say that the net benefit of you becoming a surgeon rather than you becoming a philosophy professor at an elite university, that the net costs of doing the latter and the former is roughly the equivalent of 100 lives of middle-aged people. Do you have a duty? I don't think I have that duty. Okay, but you might think, well, why not? You're going to achieve a lot more good if you become a surgeon, right? If that's true in terms of sort of long-term, why wouldn't it be true in terms of the short-term? We don't have a duty to maximize the good. In terms of the long-term, why would it be true with regard to the short-term? Let me give you another example. Imagine that you're a happily married man and you and your wife, have 2 children, which you love, and you're very pleased with it. But you're fairly busy. You're a philosophy professor, your wife's a very successful attorney, and you have busy lives, and you think, well, 2 children's enough. But you could have 10 children, right? There's 8 more children, and each of your children would be very happy or successful. In virtue of stopping at 2 children, you're going to bring a lot less good in the world, right? On average, in the U.S., the average life is worth, on some estimates, $10 million per life. So in virtue of not creating the extra lives, you've refused to bring in $80 million worth of good to the world. But we don't think that you have a duty to do so. I assume you don't think you have a duty to have the extra 8 children.
I have conflicted views on that. So, I think you have a strong axiological reason to do it.
I agree that you have a duty.
Yeah, so I think it's good to create happy people, but I don't think I do anything wrong when I.
You don't think you're doing anything wrong by having 2 children rather than 10. Is that?
But I also don't think I have a convincing theoretical explanation of why that is. All signs point to thinking there should be a duty, but that intuitively.
Fair enough. And if we're consequentials, we absolutely think that you should have such a duty. But my point is, if you don't think you have a duty to have the extra 8 children, that's going to bring a lot more good into the world than anything else you're going to do. It's doubtful that whatever work you're bringing about is going to bring about $80 million worth of benefits to others. So that would suggest that there's a very strong, reason in terms of making the world a better place to have the extra 8 children. Again, once we move away from these duties to maximize the good, what would explain the duty to save the child? Right? Again, the child does not have a right against you. It's unclear how you can have a duty owed to someone without a correlative claim. And you might think the right just is either the claim or the claim plus something else, perhaps a Hofeldian power. So given that, it's unclear once we move away from consequentialism why you have a duty to save the child.
Okay, so for theoretical reasons, you're willing to say it's permissible to bypass the child even when there's no cost to you in saving the child?
Yes. It might be the case that it indicates a bad character. it might be the case that you refuse to bring about you maximize the good, but you haven't acted wrongfully.
Okay.
And
But before we close,
it's even unclear whether you're blameworthy. We might think, well, we should blame you for that. I guess this depends on whether you can be blamed only in the case in which you try to do something wrong. Right? If you think that you can be blamed in cases even if you don't try to do something wrong, then you would be blameworthy. But if you think, which is a fairly intuitive view, that you should be blamed only if you try to do something wrong and you didn't try to do something wrong here, then you can't be blamed. What the mental state that makes you blameworthy is not well set out in the literature. I claim, people use things like the quality of will. You have a bad quality of will, but it's unclear what that is and how we analyze that. So yeah, even blameworthiness is unclear in that case. So I guess I'm not as big a fan of saving the child as most philosophers are, to their discredit.
Before we close up, there's one theoretical question I had in relation to tipping. I was wondering if you could help me with. So take a culture like I take it the UK, where tipping is seen as supererogatory, and suppose that in such a culture I promise to tip, but in the promise I say I promise to perform this supererogatory action of tipping you. Is it possible for me to then fulfill that promise? It seems like a fine promise on the surface, but once I promise to do the supererogatory action, it seems like it's no longer supererogatory because I promised it. And so you've got kind of a puzzle here about whether you can fulfill promises to do supererogatory things like tipping.
So I think once you've made a promise, it no longer is supererogatory, right? You've incurred a duty, you created a claim in another. So what was supererogatory is no longer supererogatory. So yeah, I think, look, if you make explicit promises, then, I mean, imagine you tell the server, look, I hereby promise to tip you 50%. I mean, you didn't have a duty to tip 50% before that. And imagine there's uptake. So she says, well, I hereby accept your promise, just to lock it in. So you might think, now you have a duty to tip 50%, even if you didn't originally. And I mean, this is like a lot of contracts, right? A lot of contracts, people agree to pay too much or to receive too little. That's what the contract is, because what justifies contracts are promises. So, I mean, and notice too, I mean, just to revisit the earlier decision, that you might think if it really is supererogatory, it's unclear why it's praiseworthy. So imagine, the Peter Singer student who's going to tip the server, $10, instead can give it to Oxfam Relief, will do a hell of a lot more good. Imagine it's a fancy meal, so the tip is $200, and so rather than tipping the server, the Peter Singer student is deciding, well, should I send it to Oxfam? Now you might think, look, given that it's supererogatory to give it to the server and it's supererogatory to give it to Oxfam, but it's going to do a lot more good at Oxfam, you might wonder, well, is that what the student should do? Well, I mean, if it's praiseworthy to do something and praiseworthy to do something else, it's kind of interesting. Can you be praiseworthy for doing something which is less praiseworthy than your best available alternative? I'm not sure what to say about that. And if that's the case, then it's not clear it's supererogatory to tip the server in that case. So yeah, I guess it depends on what else you're going to do with the money. I mean, imagine just a simpler case. Instead of tipping the server, you're deciding whether to give it to the homeless right outside the restaurant. And let's say the homeless, is starving. The homeless person is starving. Yeah, I mean, you might think both are supererogatory. What do you do with conflicting supererogatory duties? You might think they're both praiseworthy, or you might think that the one that's more praiseworthy is the one that remains supererogatory. I'm just not sure how to handle the case with supererogatory competitor acts.
Yeah. So just one more question on the promise puzzle. So you're a very good person. So suppose you inspire me with your goodness, and I promise you, I'm going to do at least one supererogatory action a month. Is it possible for me to fulfill that promise if I make it open-ended and not tied to any specific action? So I say I promise to do one supererogatory act a month. It seems like once I promised it, that would make whatever act I do in fulfillment of that promise no longer supererogatory. And so this innocent seeming promise becomes impossible to fulfill.
I think that's exactly right. Once you've created a duty, then it's no longer supererogatory. Now there's an issue of, if you're doing 10 supererogatory, seemingly supererogatory acts, which one is the one that satisfies the duty? So we have a problem here of what's the satisfier. But still, yeah, I mean, you might think that. Let's say you do only one seemingly supererogatory act a month. So I mean, that might be the case where, yeah, it's no longer supererogatory. You've destroyed the supererogatoriness in virtue of having made a promise. Before we start recording, I was just going to mention just one or two other things real quick, and that is, a lot of people actually think that the duty to tip is due to fairness or gratitude, right? So they actually think that this promissory theory is not correct, and it's an odd view when people talk about fairness. When people talk about fairness, it always seems to be very, very sort of unclear what they're talking about. I can understand claims of desert and I can understand rights, but people say, no, I'm talking about fairness independent of desert and rights. I kind of don't know what they're talking about. In addition, I'm also not sure why we have a duty to be fair once we've taken out desert and rights. In terms of gratitude, you might think, well, why should you express your gratitude by giving the person 20% rather than just saying thank you, or saying a very kind thing about the person? That is, why should the method of expression be done through the payment of money than through some other method? In addition, it's not clear to me that you have a duty to express gratitude. Gratitude is often thought to be something that's freely given, like mercy. But if gratitude is freely given, then it's unclear why you have a duty to give it. Nevertheless, those are two fairly common views. So, yeah. And I just want to say one other thing related to in defense of my promissory theory, because like I said, there are a lot of opponents of it out there. Number one, my promissory theory can explain why you have a duty to tip in some countries, let's say the US, Britain, and Germany, but not in others, South Korea, Japan, and Turkey. It also explains why the amount differs. Why is it 15, 20% Canada, but let's say only 10% in Britain or Germany? It also explains why you have a duty to tip some people, servers, barbers, bartenders, and caddies, but not others. I think about fast food workers, the Mr. Pink argument. So it explains several things: why the duty to tip varies in countries, why it doesn't exist in some countries, why we have a duty to pay a certain amount in some countries but different amount in others, and why we have a duty to pay certain types of workers but not other types of workers. So it explains all these things. I don't see how fairness or gratitude or any other competitors to promise can do that. And people don't like the promissory theory, then have to say why they think there's no duty to tip. And it's an odd view, right? And how to explain the sort of anecdotal sense of pretty much every person I've spoken to, that, yeah, it's kind of wrong if you tip the server unless the server's really been rude to you or done something like particularly aggressive or incompetent. And why servers think so strongly have a duty to be tipped, to receive a tip. So two things are true. One, I think it's pretty clear that we do have a duty to tip. And two, if there is a duty to tip, then it's promise-based.
Yeah, I mean, just as like a meta-philosophical point, I'm inclined to count the intuitions of servers less than customers on this point, just because they have like a clear financial incentive to want people to inculcate a duty to tip. It's the same as the politicians who strongly think that there's a duty to vote. It seems like they haven't thought much about the duty to vote. It just seems like they think that if everyone else thinks that there's a duty to vote, then they're more likely to be elected.
So I think you make an excellent point, but notice that there's alignment in two things. One, in the intuitions had by both customers and servers. So even if we think that we should discount the servers because they have an interest, skin in the game, still there's an alignment of the belief in the duty and an alignment regarding the basis of the duty. That is, that somehow there's a convention in effect, and in virtue of awareness of it and having taken certain actions, that generates the duty. So I think your point's an excellent one, but I think the alignment seems to suggest the two things are true, that there is a duty and that the duty is justified by a promise.
Well, one more question, if you don't mind. You've been very generous with your time. So, to what extent do you think?
Yeah.
To what extent do you think you can offset annoying behavior as a customer by tipping larger amounts? So it seems like customers will often tip more when they've made particularly difficult orders, or they've asked you to split the bill on an annoying ratio and told you to do the maths or something, or they've asked for they have 9 different allergy requirements, etc., etc. And that all seems fine. And if they tip, it seems like they've offset their annoyingness. But there are cases where, like, it's clearly wrong to just offset your annoyingness by tipping. You mentioned before the interview began that you were at Oxford for a year. You probably heard of the Bullingdon Club, which it's sort of a secret society where members would book restaurants. They'd have to be increasingly far from Oxford because all of the Oxford restaurants and the ones nearby had heard about them and wouldn't take them as customers, but they'd come in, they'd completely trash the place, treat the servers with no respect, but then just tip them gratuitous amounts, thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds to offset their bad behavior. And that seems wrong. So where do you think the line is between an annoying customer who just tips a little bit more because they're aware that they're annoying, and somebody who does something like that and just offsets any behavior that they engage in inside the restaurant?
Good. I think that's a superb question. So I think that you do not have. So there's a question whether when you behave, abominably, whether or not you've infringed the right of the server or the restaurant. Again, if there's no duty to insult someone, then the answer to that seems to be no, unless you're breaking their property or things like that, or touching their bodies. So I'm not sure there's a duty to behave, appropriately, because I'm not sure there's a duty to insult. Again, it might be vicious, it might be, but anyway. But no, I don't think that you eliminate your duty because you behave badly, because you pay a lot more. I think what you've done is you've compensated after the fact for the harm that you've caused, but that doesn't backtrack and make what you did earlier, assuming it was wrong, permissible. There's a scene in Godfather 1 where the young thugs acting under Paulie, they grab this press agent's camera and they smash it on the ground. Actually, Sonny Corleone does it. So he takes the guy's camera, he smashes it on the ground, but he throws a few large bills after. So would it be okay to do that? And the answer is no, because even if the cameraman is so well compensated that he's glad the transaction occurred, it didn't prevent the original act from being wrong. It didn't prevent there from being a duty to compensate, which was satisfied. It just means that after the fact, the person is no longer upset, but the original act was still wrong. And that is, you don't, if there were a duty not to insult, you might have a duty to compensate the person, but that's not going to change the original duty. Here's another example where you can see that this is you can't like backtrack to make the original act wrong. Imagine that Jeff Bezos, right, is walking around on the Washington D.C. subway, and he's grabbing riders on the subway inappropriately, and then he hands them a $10,000 pile of bills. Did he act wrongfully? The answer to that is yes, he did. Did he properly compensate them? Well, we'd have to decide what's proper compensation, but you might think that for at least some riders, $10,000 in response to an inappropriate grab would be appropriate compensation. But the fact of the matter, it would still be wrong to do it. It would have been wrong to do it when it was done. And it would be wrong after the fact, even though compensation has been paid. That's because compensation doesn't make the original wrong go away in general, and also things don't backtrack in that way. What happens, later can't backtrack in time. So there's both a metaphysical reason and a reason for the way in which rights operate. It's in fact because the act was originally wrong that you have a duty to compensate. So even if this, bunch of Oxford hooligans, probably soccer fans, more than adequately compensate the restaurants and the servers, they still acted wrongly at the time, although they may have fully satisfied their duty to pay compensation. And if they pay enough, it may be that the victim thinks, well, overall, I'm glad this transaction occurred because I'm better off for it having occurred than not. And again, using the Jeff Bezos example as an analogy here. So yeah, I mean, but you kind of gotta admire, hooligans, running amok, something like interesting and about it, yeah, whether even if it's inappropriate and wrong.
Okay, I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you so much for coming on.
So yeah, thanks, and I've really enjoyed it, and I'll be glad to come on again.